January 1986, Redstone Cemetery near Red Hill in Surrey. A small group gathers at an open grave, half a dozen people, maybe fewer, all of them hospital staff. There are no family members, no black cars from London, no flowers sent from a country estate. The woman being buried is 66 years old. She has spent the last 45 years in the institution down the road, and the people lowering her coffin are the same people who fed her, dressed her, and walked with her in the grounds. They are the closest thing to family she has. When the service ends and the grave is filled, a plastic tag is pressed into the earth. On it, a serial number, no name, no dates, no indication that the woman buried here is the niece of the Queen Mother, the granddaughter of an earl, or that her surname, Bowes-Lyon, is one of the most recognized in Britain. For decades, her family had told the world she was already dead. A reference book used by every titled house in the country had printed a death date 20 years too early, and no one had corrected it. The castle in Scotland was still standing. The gardens were still immaculate. The family name still appeared in the court circular. But this woman had been buried with less ceremony than a stranger. Her name was Narissa. She had a sister, Catherine, still alive inside the same system, still unknown to the public. And the story of how they got there, how a family that built one of Britain's most enduring dynasties learned to hide its most vulnerable members behind silence, false records, and institutional walls, stretches back more than a century, across 10 children, 2 wars, and a code of endurance that became indistinguishable from cruelty. But to understand how 2 women carrying one of Britain's most recognizable surnames ended up buried beneath decades of silence, one of them in an unmarked grave, the other in an institution she would not leave for over 70 years, you have to go back much further than the revelation that broke in the newspapers. You have to go back to the family that made the name, and to the woman who built the house that could not hold all of its children. This is the story of a dynasty that perfected the art of appearing whole, and of the 10 lives that tested, one by one, whether appearances could carry the weight of what was actually happening inside. It stretches across 5 generations, 2 world wars, a royal wedding that remade a family's public identity, and a decision made in wartime Britain that would not be fully exposed for nearly half a century. It begins not in a hospital or a cemetery, but in a marriage and a castle, and a world in which the name on the gate was supposed to be protection enough. To find the origin of the Bowes-Lyon story, you have to look at a map of eastern Scotland and find Glamis. The castle has been there, in one form or another, since the 14th century. In 1372, King Robert II granted the tannage of Glamis to Sir John Lyon, and from that single act of royal favor, the family's territorial claim descends in a line unbroken for more than 600 years. Glamis is not a minor country house, dressed up with battlements. It is a vast, turreted, pink sandstone monument to continuity, rising from the flat Angus countryside with the kind of authority that does not need to explain itself. There are formal gardens, ancient parkland, a chapel, and corridors that seem to go on longer than any private house requires. By the Victorian period, the castle had accumulated legends thicker than its walls. Shakespeare set part of Macbeth there, though the historical connection is loose at best, and stories of a hidden room, a secret passage, a monster kept behind locked doors had circulated in Scottish folklore for generations. The family discouraged such talk, as they discouraged most talk about the interior life of the house. What mattered was not the legend. What mattered was that the castle was theirs, that it had always been theirs, and that it announced to anyone who came within sight of its towers that the people who lived inside were not recently arrived. In a world where social standing rested on the depth of one's roots, the Lions of Glamis had roots that went down to bedrock. But roots alone do not sustain a dynasty. You also need money. The English half of the inheritance came through a different channel entirely. In the 18th century, the 9th Earl of Strathmore married Mary Eleanor Bowes, heiress to a substantial coal fortune built in County Durham. The Bowes wealth was industrial in origin, black, extracted, unglamorous, but the marriage laundered it, as such marriages were designed to do, into landed respectability. The union produced the hyphenated name that would carry forward Bowes-Lyon. Scottish hereditary prestige fused with English industrial capital, and the family now had 2 territorial anchors. Glamis in the north, ancient, feudal, theatrical in its stonework and its claims on history. And St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire, a graceful Queen Anne house set in gardens that stretched across formal lawns and into woodland walks, the kind of English country property that signaled not just wealth but taste, cultivation, and the quiet confidence of people who had always lived well and expected to go on doing so. That dual geography matters because it shaped the rhythm of the household for the next 100 years. The family moved between Scotland and England with the seasons, as aristocratic families did, north for the summer and autumn, south for the rest. Each house had its own staff, its own character, its own social purpose. Glamis was grander, more public, more steeped in history. St. Paul's Walden was softer, more domestic, the house where children were more likely to be born and where the mother of the family exercised her most direct authority. Between them, the two houses created a world that felt complete. A family that moved between Glamis Castle and St. Paul's Waldenbury was a family that appeared to anyone watching from the outside to lack nothing. By the second half of the 19th century, the Bowes-Lyons were not among the very richest families in Britain, but they were among the most securely placed. They had title, the earldom of Strathmore and Kinghorn, dating to 1677, and they had land, and they had the social connection that came from generations of intermarriage with other established houses. They were not flashy. They were not political in the way that the Cecils or the Cavendishes were political. They were not building metropolitan empires or jockeying for cabinet positions. They were instead exactly what the late Victorian aristocracy most valued: ancient, landholding, unpretentious, dutiful, and deeply, almost reflexively private. That privacy would later curdle into something far more troubling, but in the beginning, it looked like dignity. It looked like strength. It looked like a family that knew how to endure. Into this world, in July 1881, came a marriage that would define the next 60 years of the family's internal life. Claude Bowes-Lyon, then Lord Glamis, not yet the Earl, married Cecilia Nina Cavendish Bentinck at the Church of All Saints Petersham in Surrey. He was 26 years old, she was 19. She came from another layer of the same social world, born in Belgravia, the daughter of a clergyman connected to the Portland dukedom, raised in a household that was comfortable, educated, and Church of England in the particular way that shaped women of her class. Dutiful, practical, musically accomplished, and trained from childhood in the management of households far larger than any she would have been expected to run as a girl. Claude, for his part, had been educated at Eton, had served in the Second Life Guards, and would later take on military roles in the territorial sphere. Those who knew him remembered a man with no interest in social performance for its own sake, an unpretentious landowner with a close, practical knowledge of his farms, his tenants, his fields. He cared about drainage and fencing and crop rotation. He cared about the shooting. He cared about keeping the estates in the condition his father had left them and his son would expect to receive them. He was, in other words, a man whose deepest instinct was continuity, and the woman he married shared it. They were, by all accounts, well matched, and they would need to be. There is something about Cecilia Bowes-Lyon that resists easy characterization, and that resistance is itself the first clue to the story's deeper pattern. She was not a cold woman. She was not a negligent woman. She was not, in any conventional sense, a cruel woman. Contemporary biographical accounts describe her as a gifted hostess who could manage a house party of 30 with apparent ease, a serious musician who played the piano with genuine skill, a devoted gardener who personally oversaw the design and planting of the Italian garden at Glamis, a formal space of clipped hedges, stone pathways, and carefully staged views that still survives today, and a deeply religious woman whose faith was not decorative, but structural, the foundation on which her daily life was organized. She was a mother who invested heavily in the rhythms of her children's lives: the nursery, the schoolroom, the walks, the prayers, the seasonal movements between houses. Visitors to the household remembered warmth. They remembered order. They remembered a house that felt lived in rather than merely curated. Games in the evening, music after dinner, the particular atmosphere of a large family operating inside a structure that was both affectionate and exacting. That combination, affection and exactness, is the key to Cecilia, and the key to everything that would later go so badly wrong in the branches of the family she did not live to oversee. She believed in structure, the way some people believe in God, and in fact, she believed in both, and they reinforced each other. A household properly managed could absorb grief. A family properly ordered could withstand loss. The name, the house, the routine, the duty, these were not merely social obligations. They were the walls that held chaos out. And for decades, the walls held. They held through childhood illness and bereavement. They held through war. They held through the slow erosion of the old aristocratic certainties and the emergence of a modern world that cared less and less about titles and more about scrutiny. But walls that hold chaos out can also hold damage in. And a family trained to endure is not the same as a family trained to speak. That difference would cost the Bowes-Lyons more than any of them could have foreseen. Claude became the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn in 1904 upon the death of his father. With the title came major estates and a valuation for death duty assessment that placed the entailed Strathmore properties at £716,150, a figure that gives the story a useful sense of scale without overclaiming liquidity. They were not plutocrats. They were not building yachts or buying racehorses at the height of the market, but they commanded houses, staff, tenants, farmland, and a social position that meant the family name appeared as a matter of course in Debrett's, in Burke's peerage, and in the court circular. The machinery of aristocratic life, the shoots, the dinners, the church attendance, the local magistracies, the management of servants and cottagers, the presentation of daughters, the placement of sons into regiments and professions, ran through their calendar with the regularity of weather and with the same assumption that it would continue indefinitely. That machinery is worth understanding in detail because it is the thing the family knew how to operate. They knew how to run a great house. They knew how to manage an estate that employed dozens. They knew how to present a family to the world in a way that communicated stability, competence, and the particular kind of British confidence that comes from never having to explain where you came from. What they did not know, what almost no family of their class and era knew how to do, was accommodate the things that did not fit the presentation. Illness that could not be cured, grief that could not be absorbed into routine, children whose needs exceeded what the household structure could provide. Those failures were not yet visible, but they were latent in the design, the way a fault line is latent in stone. Cecilia and Claude had 10 children. That number alone deserves a pause because it is easy to list names and dates and lose the physical reality of what 10 children meant in a household of that era. It meant a nursery wing that was never empty for 2 decades. It meant nannies, governesses, tutors, nursery maids, a constantly shifting ecology of small people growing at different rates, needing different things, competing for attention and space and parental recognition, and being shaped, inevitably, invisibly, by the same family code. The code said, we carry on. The code said, we do not make a fuss. The code said, the name matters more than the individual complaint. Those were not spoken rules. They did not need to be. The eldest was Violet Hyacinth, born in 1882. Then came Mary Frances in 1883. Patrick in 1884. John Herbert, known as Jock, in 1886. Alexander Francis in 1887. Fergus in 1889. Rose Constance in 1890. Michael Claude Hamilton, known as Mickey, in 1893. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite in 1900, and David in 1902. 10 children across 20 years of marriage, each one entering a household that was both warm and disciplined, and each one carrying the Bowes-Lyon name into a century that would test it in ways Cecilia could not have imagined when she planted her Italian garden at Glamis, and believed that beauty, order, and faith were enough. Violet was the firstborn. In this story, she matters beyond her biography, because she is the first proof that rank cannot protect a family from the ordinary brutality of disease. She died of diphtheria in October 1893. She was 11 years old. She had been part of the nursery, part of the household's rhythm, part of the assumption that the children would grow, would learn, would take their places in the adult world their parents had built for them. And then, in the space of an illness that lasted days, she was gone. Not through scandal or misadventure, through a childhood disease that struck across every class in late Victorian Britain, though it struck hardest in emotional terms in the houses that believed themselves most protected. And Violet's death left a child-sized empty space in the family that would never be filled, and it left Cecilia and barely 31 years old, already the mother of 7, with 3 more children still to come. Carrying the knowledge that love, order, and care were not enough, you could run the house with impeccable discipline, you could manage the nursery with devotion, and a child could still die in her bed before she was 12. After Violet, Alexander. Born in 1887, the 5th child, he grew up in the shadow of his older brothers and into a life that the record preserves only faintly. He died in 1911 at 24, unmarried, reportedly from a tumor at the base of the cerebrum. His death extended the family's pattern of private loss before the Great War arrived to make such losses public, but it did so quietly, the kind of death a large family absorbs into its internal calendar of grief without the world outside much noticing. Cecilia noticed she had now buried 2 of her 10 children, both of them young, both of them taken by illness rather than misadventure, both of them removed from the family in ways that the household's code of endurance could contain but never quite resolve. The grief was absorbed into the walls, and the walls held. Patrick, born in 1884, was the eldest surviving son, and by temperament or perhaps by necessity he was the steadiest of the siblings. He would eventually inherit the earldom as the 15th Earl, and his life followed the trajectory the family's design intended: education, marriage, succession, stewardship. He was not a man who attracted crisis. He was not a man who generated headlines. He was in many ways the proof that the Bowes-Lyon system could produce what it was meant to produce, a competent, unflashy custodian of the name. But his very steadiness makes him useful in the narrative because it throws into sharper relief the fates of his brothers, who were not steady, who could not simply inherit their way through the damage. Mary Frances, born in 1883, and Rose Constance, born in 1890, married and moved into their own spheres, the daughters who did what daughters of their class were expected to do, which was to carry the family's connections outward through advantageous unions, and then largely disappear from the central story. Their lives were not without complication, but they were not the lives that would later haunt the family name. They matter here because they established the baseline. This is what the family looked like when it was working. Daughters married, sons served. The household continued. Jock, John Herbert, born in 1886, was the second son and the figure on whom much of this story's later tragedy pivots. He went into the city as a stockbroker, married Fenella Hepburn Stewart Forbes Trefusis in 1914, and might have lived a life indistinguishable from 100 other second sons of the Edwardian aristocracy if the war had not intervened. But the war did intervene, and what it did to Jock was not a single wound, but a series of damages that accumulated until the man who emerged was not the man who had gone in. He suffered an accidental gunshot wound during service. He lost a finger to amputation. He was formally acknowledged to have experienced a nervous breakdown. What the era called neurasthenia, a diagnosis that covered everything from shell shock to a collapse so total the patient could not function. He survived. He returned to Fenella, to civilian life, to a world that expected him to resume his place. But the Jock who came back was a man carrying invisible damage, and the family's code, endure, carry on, do not speak of the thing that hurts, was not equipped to help him. He died of pneumonia at Glamis in February 1930. He was 43 years old. There is something about Jock's death that the story cannot pass over quickly. When he died, he left Fenella alone with 4 surviving daughters. Their first child, Patricia, had died in infancy, another small loss absorbed into the family's accumulating ledger of grief. The remaining 4 were Anne, born in 1917 in Washington during a wartime diplomatic posting, Narissa, born in 1919, Diana, born in 1923, and Catherine, born in 1926. Anne, the eldest, would grow up to be socially visible, later marrying into circles connected to both British and Danish royalty, moving through the world with the kind of ease the Bowes-Lyon name was supposed to guarantee. Her life, lived publicly and competently, would later serve as the most painful contrast to her sisters. Same mother, same household, same widowhood, but Anne's path led outward into society, while Narissa and Catherine's led somewhere else entirely. 2 of those daughters would later be identified as having severe intellectual disabilities, And the question of what a widowed mother, operating inside the codes of an aristocratic family, increasingly exposed to royal level public scrutiny, could or should have done about that would define the rest of this family's private history. Fenella herself came from another established house, the Trefusis family, and her expectations of married life would have been shaped by the same world that shaped Jock's: duty, continuity, the assumption that the name and the structure would carry you through. She was not a wealthy woman in her own right after Jock's death. She was a war widow in all but technical classification, married to a man the war had broken, then left alone when that man died young. Her position was precarious in ways that the family's public image did not acknowledge. A mother of four, two of them profoundly disabled, embedded in a dynasty that was about to become the most watched family in Britain, with no husband and no independent means to speak of. She must be understood not as a villain, but as a woman trapped inside a system that offered no good options and punished visibility above all else. Fergus, born in 1889, is the son the nation would share. He married Lady Christian Nora Dawson Damer in 1914, the year the world changed. He went to France with the Black Watch. On the 27th of September 1915, in the Battle of Loos, he was killed. He was 26 years old. His body was recovered and buried at Quarry Cemetery, Vermelles, where the Commonwealth War Graves Commission still tends his grave. In the grammar of this family's story, Fergus is the son the house sends out in uniform and does not get back. The aristocratic ideal of service and sacrifice made flesh and then made absence. The telegram that carried the news back to Scotland would have arrived at a castle already converted into a convalescent hospital where Cecilia was tending other mothers' damaged sons in the rooms where her own children had once played. Mickey, born in 1893, survived the war, but survival came at cost. He served in France with the Black Watch like his brother, was wounded, and in April 1917 was reported missing. For months, the family did not know whether he was alive or dead. Months in which Cecilia, who had already lost Fergus, had to hold the household together while the absence of a second son hung over every room. He was eventually discovered to be a prisoner of war at Holzminden in Germany, and the relief of that discovery was real. But the Michael who returned from captivity was another man, reshaped by experience the family did not have language for, and would not seek language for, because language was not what this family did with pain. He would marry, live quietly, and die in 1953. And then Elizabeth, born in 1900, the ninth child, the fourth daughter. She arrived into a household already shaped by loss and already running on the routines laid down before she could walk. She was 7 years younger than Michael, 11 years younger than Fergus, 14 years younger than Jock. In practical terms, she grew up almost as an only child of aging parents. The older siblings had already left or were leaving, and the nursery she inhabited at St. Paul's Waldenbury was quieter than the one Violet had known 2 decades earlier. But the code was the same. The expectations were the same. And Elizabeth absorbed them with a particular aptitude that would serve her extraordinarily well in the life she did not yet know was coming. She was, by all accounts, charming from an early age, socially adept, quick with people, possessed of a warmth that was genuine but also strategic in ways she may not have fully understood as a child. She knew how to put visitors at ease. She knew how to make a room feel comfortable. These were her mother's skills, refined and transmitted, and they would carry her further than anyone in the family could have predicted. Her trajectory diverged so sharply from her siblings that the divergence becomes the story's deepest structural irony. In April 1923, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married Prince Albert, Duke of York, at Westminster Abbey. The wedding was a national event, the first royal marriage to be covered by newsreel cameras, the daughter of a Scottish earl becoming, in a single ceremony, a member of the House of Windsor. And when the abdication crisis of 1936 pushed Albert unexpectedly onto the throne as George VI, Elizabeth became queen consort, and the Bowes-Lyon name moved from the back pages of Debrett's into the consciousness of an entire empire. One branch of the family was rising into the most visible position in British public life. Another branch, Jock's branch, Fenella's branch, the branch that contained 2 daughters the public would not learn about for decades, was already beginning to disappear. David, the youngest, born in 1902, completed the set. He was the baby of the family in a house that, by the time he arrived, had already begun to know grief. He would grow up to serve in the political warfare executive during the Second World War, then hold public positions as High Sheriff and Lord Lieutenant of Hertfordshire. The kind of quiet, dutiful career that showed how one child of the same house could pass through the century relatively intact while other branches collapsed under pressures the world never saw. His presence in the story is a reminder that the same upbringing, the same code, the same household produced outcomes so divergent they barely seemed to belong to the same family. Elizabeth married a king. Jock died at 43. David became a county dignitary, and Narissa and Catherine vanished into an institution for decades. The same name, the same house, the same parents, entirely different fates. By the early 1920s, the household Cecilia had built across 4 decades was fully formed. And there is something about the shape of that household in its prime that deserves careful attention, because it is the world that would later prove unable to hold what was coming. 10 children, born across 20 years, had been raised inside the same walls, shaped by the same code, and were now dispersing into adult lives that would carry them in radically different directions. The marriages were being made. Elizabeth's 1923 wedding to the Duke of York was the most spectacular, but the other children were also settling. Patrick into estate management, Mary and Rose into marriages of their own, Michael into a quieter post-war existence. The family gathered at Glamis in the summers and autumns, and the gatherings had a particular character. The shoot in the morning, luncheon laid out for a dozen or more, the house full of cousins and neighbors, and the particular social choreography of a Scottish country house weekend. There were photographs taken on those occasions that survive. The family arranged on the lawn, the castle rising behind them, faces turned toward the camera, was the composed half-smiles of people who understood that being photographed was part of the job. Those photographs are worth thinking about, because they show exactly what the family wanted the world to see: order, continuity, a house full of people who belong to each other. What the photographs do not show is the grief already layered into the house by 3 early deaths. They do not show the war damage carried silently by the surviving sons. They do not show Jock's deterioration, or Fenella's growing isolation, or the 2 small girls, Narissa and Catherine, whose development was not following the trajectory the family expected, and whose presence in the household was already beginning to raise questions no one wanted to answer aloud. The family's social position had never been higher. Elizabeth's marriage connected the Bowes-Lyons to the crown in a way that transformed their public profile overnight. The family that had been quietly prominent, known in Scotland, respected in Debrett's, unremarkable in the national press, was now the Queen's family, the maternal line of the monarchy, a household whose every member was potentially visible to the entire country. That visibility was a gift and a trap. It meant invitations, precedents, the warm glow of royal association. It also meant that anything embarrassing, anything that did not fit the image, anything that suggested the family was less than whole had to be managed with greater care than ever before. Cecilia herself was aging now, her health declining after 10 pregnancies, 3 bereavements, a war that had turned her home into a hospital, and the slow accumulation of a sorrow she had never been permitted by temperament or by class to fully express. Claude was growing deaf, increasingly remote, a man in his 70s presiding over a household that looked, from the outside, as secure as it had ever been. They were the last generation who had built this world from the inside. They were the generation who understood its rules most deeply. And they were running out of time to pass on the one thing the rules could not teach: what to do when the rules themselves were not enough. The house was full, the gardens were immaculate, the children were nearly grown, and the family had already learned 3 times over that not every child could be kept. What it had not yet learned, what it would take another 2 decades and a far darker act to reveal, was that keeping a child and caring for a child were not the same thing, and that the family's greatest skill, its talent for absorbing damage into silence, could become, under the right pressures, indistinguishable from abandonment. And yet, before the damage becomes the story, something else must be understood. Because the family's best years were not a fiction. They were real, and they were, in their own terms, beautiful. To step inside Glamis Castle in the years before the First World War was to enter a world that felt, from the inside, as permanent as the stone it was built from. The castle operated on the rhythms of a great Scottish country house. The family arrived each summer, staff already in place, the kitchens provisioned, the gardens in bloom, the grouse moors prepared for the autumn shoot. Weekends filled the house with guests, neighboring lairds, military friends of Claude's. cousins from the wider Bowes-Lyon network, visiting clergy for Sunday services in the chapel. Meals were elaborate, served by footmen in the dining room beneath painted ceilings, and the evenings were given over to music, cards, conversation. The unhurried rituals of a class that still believed its way of life was the natural order of things. Cecilia presided over it all. She arranged the flowers, she managed the menus, she played the piano after dinner, not as performance but as atmosphere, the sound threading through the ground floor rooms, while guests settled into the evening's long, unstructured hours. There is a particular quality to life inside a house that large, a quality that anyone who has visited a great estate during its operating years will recognize. The sense that every need has been anticipated, that every surface has been tended, that the world outside the walls has been temporarily suspended. It is deeply seductive. It is also deeply misleading, because the effort required to maintain that seduction is itself a kind of concealment. St. Paul's Walden Bury offered a different version of the same promise. Where Glamis was grand and Scottish and steeped in feudal authority, St. Paul's Walden was English and intimate and domestic, a house built for living in rather than for impressing visitors. The gardens there were Cecilia's particular achievement. Formal hedges, long walks through woodland, a green theater, the Italian garden she designed and planted with a care that amounted to devotion. It was at St. Paul's Walden that the younger children spent more of their time, and it was there that the household's warmer, less ceremonial character was most visible. Elizabeth, the youngest daughter, would later describe her childhood in terms that suggested not opulence, but security. The feeling that the house, the gardens, the routines of the day were simply there, permanent and unquestioned, the way a child assumes the world will always be the way it is at breakfast. That security was not imaginary, but it was conditional on things remaining stable, and stability was about to become the family's scarcest resource. The Edwardian years, before the war came to rearrange everything, were the period when the family's confidence was most complete. Claude was Earl now, the succession settled, the estates running well, and the household moved between its two great anchors, with the regularity of the calendar itself. In Scotland, Glamis hosted shooting parties that drew the same guests year after year, the kind of country house weekends where everyone knew everyone, where the conversation at dinner returned to familiar subjects of land and sport and local affairs, and where the stability of the guest list was itself a form of reassurance. These were not people who sought novelty. They sought repetition, because repetition was proof that the world was holding its shape. In Hertfordshire, St. Paul's Walden anchored the family to the English social calendar, the garden parties, the church fetes, the neighbors who called on Sunday afternoons and were received in the drawing room with tea, and the kind of conversation that never quite touched anything urgent. The children were moving into their adult roles, and the family was watching them do so with the particular satisfaction of parents who believe the system they have built is working. Patrick, the heir, was being trained in the management of the estates, learning from Claude the practical business of land, rent, tenants, livestock, the work that held a great property together beneath its decorative surface. Mary Frances had married. Rose was moving through the social world that would produce her own match. Jock was established in the city, a stockbroker, apparently settled, apparently competent, apparently the kind of second son who would make his own way without troubling the main line. Fergus and Michael were moving toward the military, the natural destination for younger sons of their class, the profession that conferred honor without requiring wealth, and that answered the question of what one did with boys who would not inherit the estate. Elizabeth and David, still children, were in the nursery wing, growing up inside a house that had already lost two of its members, Violet to diphtheria, Alexander to a brain tumor, but had not yet encountered the kind of catastrophe that could not be absorbed into the calendar and carried forward. The social world the Bowes-Lyons inhabited was itself a kind of machinery. There were the London seasons, though the family was not especially metropolitan. There were the country house circuits, the dinners, the christenings, the weddings that linked one great family to another through a web of obligation and kinship so dense it functioned as its own closed economy. There was the church. There was the local community in Angus and Hertfordshire, where the family's role as landowners carried duties, tenants to manage, cottages to maintain, school prizes to give, fetes to attend, that reinforced the public identity of a family that served as well as owned. And above all, there was the quiet, pervasive assumption that all of this would continue. The estate would pass to Patrick, the daughters would marry well, the sons would serve, the name would endure. That assumption was not arrogant, it was simply the air these people breathed. The invisible architecture of a class that had lived this way for so long, it had ceased to notice the architecture was there. Elizabeth's wedding in April 1923 was the family's apotheosis, the moment when everything Cecilia had built seemed to reach its natural conclusion. Her youngest daughter, the charming, socially gifted girl who had grown up between Glamis and St. Paul's Walden, was marrying into the royal family. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey was national news. The guests included the king and queen. The photographs show a young woman in a veil and a medieval-style dress, her expression poised, her bearing already suggesting the public composure that would define her for the next 80 years. For Cecilia, then 60 years old and already carrying the accumulated grief of two dead children and a war that had killed a third and damaged a fourth, the wedding must have felt like vindication. The house had held, the name had risen, the code had produced, in at least one of its children, exactly what it was designed to produce: a woman who could enter the most scrutinized family in Britain and perform, with apparent ease, the role the nation required. But the wedding was also the moment the trap began to close. Because from 1923 onward, the Bowes-Lyon name belonged not only to the family but to the public. Every member of the dynasty was now potentially visible. And visibility, for a family that had always managed its difficulties in private, was the one thing the code could not accommodate. The years that followed the wedding were, on the surface, the family's golden autumn. Elizabeth's marriage drew the Bowes-Lyons into a wider circle of royal engagements, court appearances, and public attention that enhanced the family's already considerable social standing. Glamis became a place the Duke and Duchess of York visited, and the arrival of the royal couple transformed the castle's summer gatherings from the private rituals of a Scottish aristocratic family into events that the press noticed and photographers attended. Elizabeth's first daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth II, was born in 1926, the same year as Catherine Bowes-Lyon, a coincidence of birth dates that would later require a bitter irony, given how differently the two girls' lives would unfold. Cecilia, now a grandmother to a princess, inhabited a position of social eminence that would have seemed improbable when she married a minor Scottish lord's son in Petersham in 1881. The dynasty she and Claude had built was by any external measure a success. Patrick, now in his 40s, was established as the steady, untroubling heir. Rose had married and settled. David was building a career in public service. Michael was living quietly, damaged but functional, the war receding into the past even if its effects had not. The family's losses, Violet, Alexander, Fergus, were carried internally, mentioned in prayers and commemorated in stone, but not allowed to define the household's public character. The Bowes-Lyons were, to anyone who observed them from the outside, a family that had endured what many families of their generation had endured, and that had come through it with their name, their houses, their social position, and their composure intact. There is something worth sitting with in what that composure actually cost. The household looked stable. The gardens were maintained, the rituals continued, but Cecilia, by the 1920s, was a woman who had buried 3 children and nursed a fourth through the aftermath of war. She had watched Glamis Castle, her home, turned into a convalescent hospital where strangers bled and healed in the rooms where her own sons had once slept. She had maintained her composure through all of it, through Violet's death in the nursery, through Alexander's quiet decline, through the telegram about Fergus, through the months of not knowing whether Michael was alive or dead, because composure was what the house demanded, and because she believed, with the unshakable conviction of her class and her faith, that composure was the proper response to grief. Not the only response, the proper one. The one that preserved the family's dignity and the household's function and the children's sense that the world was still orderly, even when it was not. Claude reinforced this without contradiction. He was by the 1920s growing deaf, a physical condition that was also, in its way, a metaphor. He had always been a man of few words, more comfortable with the land than with emotional conversation, more fluent in the language of estate management than in the language of the heart. His deafness narrowed his world further. He became a figure of quiet, remote authority, present at the head of the table, present at the shoot, present in the chapel on Sundays, but increasingly unreachable. The household still orbited around him because that was how a great house worked, but the orbit was formal rather than intimate. The children loved him by most accounts, but they did not confide in him, and he did not ask them to. He was a man who believed, without ever having needed to articulate the belief, that if the estate was properly managed and the household properly run, the people inside it would be all right. That belief had served him for decades. It would not serve him now. The war had ended. but its aftermath was still reshaping the household from the inside. Fergus was buried in France, at Quarry Cemetery, Vermelles, a name that Cecilia would carry in her memory for the rest of her life, the place where her son's body lay in foreign soil, while his name remained carved into the memorial at Glamis. Michael had returned from Holzminden, but the captivity had left its mark. He was quieter, more guarded, a man who had learned at close range what it meant to lose control of his own existence, and who carried that knowledge in a way the family recognized only by not questioning it. He would marry eventually and settle into a life that was outwardly conventional. But there was a quality of withdrawal about Michael, a perimeter of privacy he maintained around himself that spoke of damage the household's code of endurance had no mechanism to address. The family accepted that withdrawal in the same way it accepted everything that could not be discussed, by acting as though it were not there. Beneath the household's composure, Jock's neurasthenia had not resolved. He had returned from the trenches diminished, a man who had gone to war as a competent city stockbroker and come back as something less certain, less anchored, more fragile than the Bowes-Lyon code had room for. His drinking may have worsened, though the record is discreet on this point, as it was discreet on everything that happened inside the house. The symptoms of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, the anxiety, the sleeplessness, the sense of a self that does not quite cohere, were understood in the 1920s not as a medical condition requiring treatment, but as a weakness requiring will. The family's response to Jock's condition was shaped by that understanding. He was expected to manage. He was expected to carry on. He was expected to be the father and husband his position required him to be, and the fact that the war had damaged the machinery that made those roles possible was treated not as a crisis requiring intervention, but as a test of character that the family assumed would eventually be passed. And in the branch of the family that would carry the heaviest legacy, something was becoming impossible to ignore. Fenella and Jock's daughters were growing, and at least two of them, Narissa and Catherine, were not developing as expected. The precise nature and timing of the family's awareness is not fully documented. What is documented is this. Narissa, born in 1919, and Catherine, born in 1926, would later be described as having severe intellectual disabilities. Whether the family understood the extent of their condition in the 1920s, or whether the recognition came gradually and reluctantly over the following decade, cannot be stated with certainty. What can be stated is that the household in which these girls were growing up, a household built on the assumption that every child would take its place in the adult world of the family, had no model for a child who could not. There was no language for it, there was no plan. There was only the gathering awareness, somewhere inside the family's private rooms, that two of its youngest members did not fit the structure, and that the structure, rigid as it was, could not bend to accommodate them. Jock himself was deteriorating. His health had never fully recovered from the war, and the years after 1918 were marked by a slow, visible decline that the family managed in the way it managed everything. Internally, without public acknowledgement, with the expectation that the household's routines would carry the burden. Fenella held the domestic side together. She raised the girls. She kept house. She did what wives of her class and era did. She endured. But Jock's condition, physical, psychological, the two braided together in ways that early 20th century medicine was poorly equipped to untangle, was worsening year by year. And by the late 1920s, it was clear to anyone close to the family that the second son of the house was not going to grow old. The first fracture in the second generation, the event that broke the branch of the family from which the hidden daughters would come, arrived at Glamis in February 1930. It was winter in Angus, which meant short days, cold stone, the castle's corridors holding their chill even with fires lit in every occupied room. Jock was 43 years old. He had been unwell for some time, not dramatically, not in a way that made for a single alarming moment, but in the slow, grinding way that a body already weakened by war weakens further, year by year, until the reserves are gone and even a common illness becomes lethal. The pneumonia that killed him was not a sudden assault. It was the final blow in a long sequence of physical and nervous collapse that stretched back to the trenches, through the gunshot accident, the amputation, the neurasthenia, the years of a man trying to function inside a life that required a kind of steadiness the war had taken from him. Fenella had watched this deterioration at close range. She had managed the household around it. She had raised the girls while Jock's health failed, month by month in rooms where the family codes had won, carried on, and did not dramatize. The death itself happened at the castle. The precise circumstances, which room, What time of day, who was at the bedside, still are not recorded in the public accounts with the kind of specificity one might wish for. What is known is that Jock died at Glamis, in winter, in the ancestral seat of a family that had absorbed private tragedy behind its walls for centuries, and that the household's response was what the household's response always was: composed, managed, correct. There would have been a doctor. There would have been Fenella, exhausted, the weight of what had been coming for years, finally settling into permanence. There would have been the particular silence that enters a house when someone who occupied a fixed place in its daily life, a chair at the table, a step on the stair, a voice in the morning, is suddenly and irrevocably absent. The children would have felt it immediately, even the youngest. Anne was 12. Narissa was 10. Diana was 6. Catherine was 3. Their father, however diminished, however damaged by the war and its aftermath, had been the other adult in the house, the presence that confirmed the domestic structure was intact, and now he was gone. The funeral was held. The mourning was observed. The family gathered, as it did at such moments, and the rituals of grief, the black clothes, the letters of condolence, the quiet weeks that followed, proceeded according to the forms the Bowes-Lyon knew by heart. But something had broken that the forms could not repair. There was a funeral. There was mourning. The household observed the forms. Claude was still alive, still the Earl, still presiding over Glamis, with the deaf, remote authority that was all he had left to offer. Cecilia was 77, her health failing, her world narrowing. Patrick would continue as heir. The family structure held in the sense that the houses were still maintained, the name still carried weight, the social obligation still performed. But Jock's death cracked something that the household's code of endurance could not repair, because it left Fenella, 40 years old, widowed, without independent wealth or independent authority, as the sole parent of 4 daughters, 2 of whom needed care the family's existing arrangements were not designed to provide. There is something about Fenella's position after February 1930 that requires careful attention, because the temptation is to make her either a villain or a victim, and she was neither, or perhaps she was both, in the way that people inside impossible systems often are. She was a widow in an aristocratic family whose emotional and financial support systems depended on the existence of a living husband. Jock was gone, and with him went Fenella's primary connection to the Bowes-Lyon power structure. She was still the mother of the Earl's granddaughters. She still had a place in the family. But it was a dependent place, a peripheral place, the place of a woman whose status derived from a man who was now dead and whose children included 2 daughters the family did not know what to do with. Anne, the eldest, was 12 in 1930, old enough to understand that her father was gone, old enough to absorb the household's grief and its unspoken codes of behavior. She was developing normally, and her trajectory was already visible. She would be educated, presented, married. She would move through the social world at the Bowes-Lyon name open to her, and she would do so with the competence the family expected of its women. Her future contained courts, connections, eventually a marriage that would link her to Danish royalty. She was, in a sense, the proof that the system could still produce what it was meant to produce. Narissa at 10 and Catherine at 3 were a different matter. Narissa was old enough that her condition would have been apparent to anyone spending sustained time in the household. The gap between her development and that of other children her age widening with each passing year. Catherine was still very young enough that the full extent of her disability may not yet have been clear, but young enough, too, that the question of her future was already pressing on Fenella with the particular weight of a problem that had no good solution and no prospect of improving with time. What options did Fenella have? She could keep the girls at home, in a household that was now her responsibility to manage alone, without a husband's income or authority. She could seek help from the wider Bowes-Lyon family. But the wider Bowes-Lyon family was itself in flux, adjusting to its new position as the Queen's kin, navigating the pressures of increased public exposure, and not obviously equipped or inclined to take on the care of 2 disabled girls whose existence complicated the family narrative. She could look for institutional solutions. But institutional solutions in the 1930s meant something very different from what they mean today. The large residential hospitals for people with intellectual disabilities were, by later standards, grim, regimented, and isolating. They were also, for families of Fenella's class, the solution that medical opinion and social convention jointly endorsed. A respectable family did not keep its disabled members visible. A respectable family found a place for them, a quiet place, a place with proper care, or what passed for proper care in an era that believed segregation was kindness. Meanwhile, the world outside was tightening around the family in ways that made deferral more dangerous. Elizabeth's husband was now Duke of York, second in line to the throne, and the machinery of royal publicity was drawing the Bowes-Lyon name into ever greater visibility. Cecilia had been photographed at the 1923 wedding. The family appeared in newsreels and in the press. The old privacy that had been the dynasty's most reliable defense was eroding, not because the family had chosen to abandon it, but because one of its daughters had married into a household where privacy was not permitted. Every aunt, every cousin, every niece of the new duchess was potentially a subject of public interest. And in that new environment, the existence of two severely disabled granddaughters of the old earl was not merely a private sorrow, it was a potential vulnerability. Cecilia died in June 1938. She was 76 years old. She died at a house in London, 20 Portman Square, the family's town address. After years of declining health, her body worn by 10 pregnancies, 4 bereavements, a war that had occupied her home, and the quiet, relentless labor of holding a dynasty together through decades of accumulating grief. She had been the center of the household for 57 years. She had managed the houses, the gardens, the children, the social calendar, the correspondence, the staff, the tenants, the church commitments, and the emotional landscape of a family that had been trained, under her guidance, to carry its pain internally. She had survived Violet, survived Alexander, survived Fergus, survived Jock. She had watched Elizabeth marry into the royal family and had lived long enough to see the abdication crisis transform her youngest daughter into queen consort. She had known, in some measure, to some degree that the records do not specify, about the difficulties in Jock's branch, about Fenella's position, about the 2 granddaughters who were not developing as the family expected. What she would have done about those difficulties had she lived is one of the story's unanswerable questions. What is certain is that she did not live to answer it. She was buried at Glamis, in the grounds of the castle she had tended with such devotion, and the family she left behind was already fractured, not by open quarrel, not by public scandal, but by the silent structural separation that occurs when one branch rises into public view while another sinks beneath the threshold of acknowledgement. Her death removed the last figure in the family who might have possessed both the authority and the personal connection to intervene in the fate of Narissa and Catherine. Cecilia was the matriarch. She was the woman who built the code. She was also the woman the code answered to. Without her, the code continued to operate, but the judgment, the human judgment that might have tempered its harshest applications was gone. Claude survived her by 6 years, dying in November 1944 at 89, by which time the act that would define the family's darkest chapter had already been committed. He spent his final years as a deaf, elderly widower in a castle that had once been full of children and was now full of their absence. A man who had outlived his wife, outlived 4 of his 10 children, and outlived the world in which his values had been sufficient to the demands placed upon them. The consequences of Jock's death took 11 years to reach their full expression, and that delay is itself the point. The family did not rush toward the decision that would later haunt it. The decision was deferred and deferred again and deferred again while the pressures mounted, financial, social, emotional, institutional, until the deferral itself became unsustainable. Between 1930 and 1941, Fenella raised her daughters in a family whose public profile was intensifying with every passing year. The abdication crisis of December 1936 was the event that changed everything. Edward VIII's decision to give up the throne for Wallis Simpson was, for the Bowes-Lyons, not an abstract constitutional drama, but an intimate catastrophe. It thrust Elizabeth's husband, a man who had never expected to be king, who suffered from a debilitating stammer, who had married into the role of a younger brother and to the throne as George VI. Overnight, Elizabeth became queen consort. Overnight, the Bowes-Lyon name moved from the social pages to the front pages. Overnight, every member of the wider family became a person of potential public interest. Every cousin, every niece, every connection that could be traced, photographed, written about, scrutinized. The implications for Fenella's branch were immediate and devastating, though the devastation was not visible. In a family that had always been merely aristocratic, 2 profoundly disabled nieces were a private sorrow that could be managed within the household's existing structures of discretion. In a family that was now the Queen's family, 2 profoundly disabled nieces were a vulnerability, a potential source of public attention, of press curiosity, of the kind of scrutiny that could damage the monarchy's carefully constructed image of stability and health. Whether anyone in the family articulated this calculation in so many words is not known, but the calculation was there, embedded in the structure of the situation, waiting to produce its consequences. By 1940, Europe was at war again. Britain was under bombardment. The royal family was performing its most visible and symbolically important role, staying in London, visiting bombed neighborhoods, projecting the kind of steadiness and shared sacrifice that held public morale together. The king and queen were symbols of national resilience. Their family, by extension, had to project the same image. Anything that complicated that image, anything that suggested weakness, abnormality, hereditary deficiency, was not merely unwelcome. It was in the logic of wartime public relations dangerous. And somewhere inside the wider family network, arrangements were being made, not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, administratively, in the way that difficult things were done by families who had spent centuries learning how to manage difficulty without making a scene. The exact sequence of conversations, consultations, and decisions that led to the Earlswood placement is not fully documented. What is documented is the outcome. Narissa was 21 years old. Catherine was 14. And the decision, whoever made it, whatever the exact reasoning, whatever combination of medical advice, family pressure, wartime disruption, financial limitation, and social terror produced it, had already been taken. The only question left was where they would go, and then what the family would say about them once they were gone. To understand what was about to happen to Narissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, you have to understand the place they were being sent to and the world that built it. Royal Earlswood Hospital sat on the outskirts of Red Hill in Surrey, a Victorian institution originally founded in 1855 as the Royal Earlswood Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles. The name alone tells you something about the era that created it and the attitudes that sustained it for nearly a century and a half. It had been established, in the reforming spirit of mid-Victorian philanthropy, as a purpose-built facility for people with intellectual disabilities, a place where, in the language of the time, those who could not care for themselves would be cared for by others in a structured, supervised, medically overseen environment that removed them from the communities and families that had no framework for their needs. The royal in its name derived from the patronage of Prince Albert, who had laid the foundation stone, lending the institution an air of establishment respectability that no doubt made it easier for socially conscious families to accept the idea of sending their relatives there. The buildings were substantial: red brick, institutional corridors, dormitory wards, exercise yards, workshops. It was set in grounds that, from a distance, might have resembled the parkland of a country house, but up close revealed the barred windows, the locked doors, the architecture of containment dressed in the language of care. It was not a prison, not technically, but it operated on many of the same principles: order, routine, separation from the outside world, and the assumption that the people inside were better off there than anywhere else. By the 1930s, Royal Earlswood was one of a network of such institutions scattered across England. Dozens of them in every county, housing a population that the state and the medical profession had jointly decided was best kept apart from the rest of society. They went by various names: hospitals, colonies, certified institutions, and they housed tens of thousands of people whose primary qualification for admission was that they had been judged by medical professionals and by their families to be incapable of independent life. The residents were overwhelmingly from working class and lower middle class backgrounds because wealthy families had other options: private nursing, live-in carers, discreet arrangements within the household. But wealthy families also used institutions, particularly when the disability was severe, when the family's public profile made home care awkward, or when the combination of shame and medical advice converged on the same recommendation. A doctor would assess the patient, a form would be signed, a bed would be allocated, and the person, often a child, often a young woman, often someone who had no say in the matter, would be admitted. And the door would close behind them, and in many cases it would not open again for decades. And there is a particular kind of cruelty in an arrangement that presents itself as care. The institutions of this era were not, for the most part, deliberately brutal. They were understaffed, underfunded, overcrowded, and governed by a philosophy that regarded segregation as the humane alternative to neglect. The staff were often well-meaning. The routines, meals, activities, walks in the grounds, supervised recreation were designed to provide structure and, in their own limited terms, comfort. But the residents had no autonomy, they had no privacy, they had no say in where they lived, what they did, whom they saw, or whether they stayed. They were, in the fullest sense of the word, managed, their lives shaped entirely by the decisions of others, their identities reduced to the medical categories that justified their admission, their futures foreclosed by a single assessment made, in many cases, when they were children. The daily reality of a place like Earlswood in the 1940s can be reconstructed from the accounts of staff and visitors who saw these institutions at close range. Residents slept in dormitory wards, rows of iron beds, uniform bedding, personal possessions kept to a minimum. They rose at set times, ate at set times, walked at set times, went to bed at set times. There were workshops where those capable of simple tasks were given repetitive work, laundry, sewing, cleaning, not as therapy in any modern sense, but as occupation, a way of filling the hours between meals. There were exercise yards, gardens of a sort, communal recreation rooms with hard chairs and high windows. The building smelled of disinfectant and institutional cooking and the particular staleness that accumulates in any place where the same people live in the same rooms for years without change. For someone who had grown up in a household with gardens, music, the warmth of siblings, the texture of family life, however imperfect that family life had been, the transition to Earlswood would have been a severance so complete it is difficult to imagine from the outside. And the crucial thing is this: the admission was not understood by the people who arranged it as a severance. It was understood as a placement, a solution, the right thing to do given the circumstances. The doctors recommended it, the family accepted the recommendation, the institution received the patients. Everyone involved was operating inside a system that told them this was care. And the system was wrong, but the people inside it did not know that, or did not allow themselves to know it, because knowing it would have required a kind of moral reckoning that the era did not demand and that the family's code of silence actively prevented. It was into this system that Narissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were about to be placed, and they would not be placed alone. The detail that lifts this story out of the realm of a single family's private failure and into something more systemic is the Fane cousins. Fenella Bowes-Lyon was born Fenella Hepburn Stewart Forbes Trefeses. She had a sister, Harriet, who had married into the Fane family, and Harriet's children included three daughters who, like Narissa and Catherine, had severe intellectual disabilities. The names recorded are Idonia, Etheldreda, and Rosemary Fane. They were Narissa and Catherine's first cousins on the maternal side, and all five women, two Bowes-Lyons and three Fanes, would be admitted to Royal Earlswood on the same day. That fact is extraordinary, and it deserves to be held carefully because it shifts the story's center of gravity. This was not one family producing two disabled children by unhappy chance. This was two related families linked through the maternal line, through the Trefusis blood that Fenella and Harriet shared, producing five disabled children across two households. The pattern was unmistakable. It suggested something hereditary, a genetic factor passed through the sisters' bloodline that expressed itself with devastating consistency in the next generation. Whether the families understood this in genetic terms is doubtful. The science of inherited intellectual disability was poorly understood in the 1930s, and the social stigma attached to any suggestion of hereditary deficiency was in aristocratic circles overwhelming. What the families understood, at a minimum, was that something had gone wrong in the same way in the same generation, in both branches, and the solution they arrived at, thus a coordinated solution, a joint decision carried out on a single day, was the same for all five. Institutional placement at the same hospital, out of sight, out of the family's public narrative, out of the world. The coordination itself is striking. This was not a case of two families independently arriving at the same conclusion. It was a case of two families acting together, placing five related women in the same institution on the same date. That suggests planning. It suggests consultation between the families. It suggests a shared understanding of the problem and a shared agreement on the solution. Whether that consultation was led by doctors, by family elders, by solicitors, or by some combination of all three, the effect was the same: a unified response to a shared hereditary crisis, carried out with the kind of administrative efficiency that these families understood, and that the institutional system of the era was designed to facilitate. Five women, one admission date, one hospital, and then, as far as the public record was concerned, silence. The implications of that maternal line pattern rippled outward in ways the family could not have wanted to confront. If the disability was hereditary, then it was not an accident. It was a feature of the bloodline. And in a family now connected by marriage to the British Crown, a hereditary condition that produced severe intellectual disability was not merely a private sorrow. It was, in the logic of the era, an era still influenced by eugenics, still shaped by the belief that good breeding produced good people and bad breeding produced damaged ones, a potential catastrophe for the family's public identity. The eugenic dimension of this story needs to be understood not as a fringe belief, but as a mainstream conviction. In the 1930s and 40s, the idea that intellectual disability was hereditary and that the responsible course of action was to prevent its transmission through segregation and, in extreme cases, sterilization, was not the province of cranks. It was taught in medical schools. It was endorsed by respectable public health authorities. It was embedded in legislation. The Mental Deficiency Act of 1913 had given local authorities the power to detain people classified as mentally defective, and the categories used, idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded persons, moral defectives, were not slurs, but legal terms, terms that appeared on official forms and in medical textbooks and in the correspondence of perfectly well-educated, perfectly well-intentioned professionals who believed they were acting in the public interest. The idea that a family might want to conceal a hereditary pattern of disability was not in this context irrational. It was strategic, it was self-protective, and it was entirely consistent with the advice that doctors, clergymen, and social workers would have offered to a family in the Bowes-Lyon's position. The Bowes-Lyons were the Queen's family. Their blood was, in a symbolic sense, the nation's blood. And the suggestion that that blood carried a flaw, a weakness, a propensity for producing children who could never take their place in society was a suggestion the family had every incentive to suppress. Not because they were uniquely heartless, but because the world they inhabited, and the world of titles, peerages, royal marriages, and public duty, measured families by the quality of their bloodlines, and a bloodline that produced severe disability was, by the standards of that world, a bloodline that had failed. Whether the decision to institutionalize Narissa, Catherine, and the Fane cousins was driven primarily by eugenic anxiety, or by genuine inability to provide adequate care at home, or by medical advice that institutional placement was in the patient's best interest, or by financial constraints that made private care impossible, or by some combination of all of these, cannot be determined with certainty from the available record. That ambiguity is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. The record is incomplete precisely because the family ensured that it would be incomplete. The conversations that took place, the medical assessments that were commissioned, the advice that was sought from doctors and from solicitors, the objections that may or may not have been raised by Fenella or by anyone else. All of this happened behind the walls of a family whose defining skill was privacy and whose defining failure was the inability to distinguish between privacy and concealment. The family knew how to be discreet. It did not know, or did not allow itself to know, that discretion about a dining room indiscretion and discretion about the disappearance of two living relatives are not the same act, even if they feel from the inside like they draw on the same instinct. What is known is this. Fenella was the parent most directly involved. She was the one who lived with the girls, who saw their condition daily, who bore the practical weight of their care in a household that no longer had a father, no longer had a patriarch's income, and no longer had the kind of domestic infrastructure that a fully staffed aristocratic home could provide. She was also the one with the least institutional power within the wider Bowes-Lyon family. A widow, dependent on the wider family's goodwill and financial support, embedded in a dynasty whose priorities were being reshaped by its proximity to the crown. Whether Fenella chose Earlswood freely, or whether the choice was made for her by family members with more authority and more to lose, is one of the questions the record cannot answer. The silence that surrounds her is the silence of a woman whose voice was never recorded, whose letters, if they existed, were not preserved, and whose inner life must be inferred entirely from the decisions attributed to her and the consequences those decisions produced. Some later accounts, including testimony linked to the family through Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, Anne's daughter, Fenella's granddaughter, suggest that Fenella continued to visit the girls after their admission, that she maintained contact, that gifts were sent, that the relationship between mother and institutionalized daughters was not the clean severance the later documentaries would depict. Other accounts, including the recollections of Earlswood staff interviewed decades later for the 2011 Channel 4 documentary, tell a different story. They suggest that family visits were rare or non-existent, that the girls received no visitors they could identify as relatives, that the institutional records showed no pattern of family engagement, that Narissa and Catherine lived for decades inside Earlswood with no sustained connection to the people who had placed them there. Both versions may contain elements of truth, Both may be shaped by the motivations and the limitations of the people telling them. The family's defenders had every reason to emphasize continued contact, because continued contact is the difference between a difficult decision and an act of abandonment. The institution's staff had every reason to emphasize absence, because absence confirmed the narrative of aristocratic callousness that made the story powerful when it finally became public. The truth, as is so often the case with families that guard their privacy this fiercely, may lie in a middle ground that satisfies no one. Intermittent contact in the early years, sporadic attention that dwindled over time, good intentions that were never quite sufficient to the scale of the need, and a gradually widening distance between the family's public life and the institutional life of the two women it had placed beyond the reach of public knowledge. Fenella herself would die in 1966, 25 years after the admission. 25 years during which the question of her relationship with Narissa and Catherine remained unanswered in the public record, because the public did not yet know there was a question to ask. While Narissa and Catherine were moving toward Earlswood, the rest of the family was moving in the opposite direction, toward greater visibility, greater public responsibility, greater distance from anything that might complicate the image. Elizabeth, by 1940, was queen consort. She and George VI were performing the most symbolically important role of the war, staying in London during the Blitz, visiting bombed communities, embodying the nation's determination to endure. The Queen was photographed in rubble. She was photographed with evacuees. She was photographed smiling at soldiers, at nurses, at factory workers. She became, in the public imagination, the face of British resolve. Warm, composed, unyielding, a woman who had chosen to stay when lesser figures might have fled. Buckingham Palace itself was bombed in September 1940, and Elizabeth's response, widely reported, was to say she was glad because now she could look the East End in the face. Whether or not those were her exact words, the sentiment was perfectly calibrated to the national mood, and it was perfectly in character for a woman raised in the Bowes-Lyon household, where composure under pressure was the first and deepest lesson. The Bowes-Lyon name, by association, was burnished to a shine it had never possessed before 1936. The family of the Queen was, by extension, the family of the nation, and the nation expected that family to be whole, healthy, and unblemished. There is no evidence that Elizabeth herself was involved in the decision to institutionalize her nieces. Later reporting suggests she may not have fully understood the truth about Narissa and Catherine until decades later, until 1982, when supporters of the hospital wrote to her directly. That timeline, if accurate, means the Queen Mother lived through more than 40 years of her niece's institutional confinement without knowing it was happening. Whether that ignorance was genuine or whether it was the kind of carefully maintained not knowing that the family's code made possible, the kind where you do not ask the question because you do not want to hear the answer, is another of the story's unanswerable riddles. Patrick, the 15th Earl of Strathmore, was managing the estates and fulfilling his duties as the family's senior male figure. He had inherited in 1944 after Claude's death, and he carried the earldom with the same undemonstrative competence his father had shown, the same attachment to the land, the same belief that continuity was the highest value, the same instinct that the family's private affairs were private and that the household's function was to absorb difficulty without broadcasting it. He was not a man of public drama. He kept Glamis running through the privations of wartime and the austerity that followed. He maintained the family's position in Scottish society. He did what heirs did. He continued. The castle still hosted guests, still maintained its gardens, still presented itself to the world as a monument to continuity. Whatever Patrick knew about Narissa and Catherine, and the heir to the earldom would, one assumes, have known something, he did not intervene in their placement, did not challenge the family's arrangement, did not break the silence. Rose was settled in her own domestic world. David was serving in the political warfare executive, contributing to the war effort in the discreet, unglamorous way that younger sons of his background contributed, through intelligence, through connections, through the machinery of a state at war. He would die in 1961 at 59, a man who had spent his life in public service without ever becoming publicly conspicuous. Michael was alive, quiet, aging, carrying whatever the years since Holzminden had left him carrying. He would die in 1953 at 60. The generation of Cecilia's children was thinning one by one, each death narrowing the circle of people who had known the family in its fullness and who might have understood what the institutionalization of Narissa and Catherine meant in the context of everything that had come before. And Anne, Fenella and Jock's eldest daughter, sister to Narissa and Catherine, was moving through the world with her name intact and her future open. She was 23 in 1940, a young woman of marriageable age, connected through her Aunt Elizabeth to the royal circle. She had been presented at court as women of her background were presented: the white dress, the curtsy, the formal acknowledgement that she was now available for the social world and for marriage. Her trajectory would carry her into a life of considerable social visibility. She would eventually marry Viscount Anson in 1938, beginning a life among the circles of the landed gentry. That marriage would later end in divorce, and Anne would marry again, Prince Georg of Denmark, a connection that placed her within the orbit of European royalty. Her daughter, Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, would later become one of the family's most vocal defenders, publicly challenging the narrative of total abandonment that documentaries and press reports would construct around Narissa and Catherine's story. Anne's life, by any measure, was a life the family could acknowledge without reservation. She was doing what Bowes-Lyon women were supposed to do: marrying well, moving through society with grace, carrying the name forward into the next generation of aristocratic and royal connection. The contrast between Anne's life and her sister's is the story's most devastating structural irony, and it bears examination not because it reveals villainy, but because it reveals the mechanism. Same mother, same household, same bereavement, same widowhood, same family code. But Anne could perform the role the family required, could be presented, could socialize, could marry, could represent the name in public, and Narissa and Catherine could not. The family's system had room for Anne. It did not have room for her sisters, and the system's response to what it could not accommodate was not adaptation, but removal. Not cruelty in the sense of deliberate malice. Something worse, cruelty in the sense of a structure so rigid that the people inside it could not see the humanity of those who fell outside it. Diana, the third daughter, born in 1923, occupied a middle position that complicates any simple reading of the family's behavior. She survived into adulthood and would later marry quietly, without the social prominence that marked Anne's life, but without the institutional erasure that marked her younger sisters. Her existence proves that the family did not discard all of Jock and Fenella's children, only the ones who could not pass. Diana could pass. She could function in the world, could marry, could sustain the appearance of a normal life. She was not hidden. She was not institutionalized. She was not declared dead in a reference book. Whatever the precise nature of her capabilities, they fell within the range that the family structure could absorb. She remained inside the circle. Narissa and Catherine were placed outside it, and the circle closed behind them. By the spring of 1941, the decision was final. The arrangements had been made. The institutional paperwork had been prepared. 5 women from 2 related families, Narissa Bowes-Lyon, Catherine Bowes-Lyon, Idonia Fane, Etheldreda Fane, and Rosemary Fane, were to be admitted to Royal Earlswood Hospital in a single coordinated action. The admission would be simultaneous, it would be quiet, it would be, in every sense the family understood, managed. The war provided cover, and that fact should not be passed over. Britain in 1941 was a country in motion. Evacuations, relocations, disruptions of every kind, reshaping the domestic landscape on a daily basis. Families were being separated by circumstance across the country. Children were being sent to the countryside to escape the bombing. Households were being reorganized around rationing, conscription, and the constant threat of air raids. In that context, the movement of 5 disabled women from their homes to an institution in Surrey was unremarkable. A minor administrative event in a country overwhelmed by administrative events, lost in the paperwork of a nation at war. No press attended, no public notice was given, no questions were asked because no one outside the family knew there were questions to ask. The family's ability to manage its private affairs in private, the skill it had cultivated across generations, was operating at full efficiency at exactly the moment when the consequences of that skill were most devastating. And yet there is something about this specific timing that cannot be ignored, something that presses on the story with a weight that demands attention. Cecilia was dead. She had died 3 years earlier. The woman who built the household, who set its codes, who might have possessed both the authority and the personal investment to resist the institutional solution, or to ensure that it was accompanied by sustained, attentive, unrelenting care. The matriarch was gone. Claude was 86, deaf, diminished, an old man at the end of his capacities, living out his final years in a castle that echoed with the absences of the children who had filled it 40 years earlier. The generation that had built the family's domestic world. The generation that had known Violet, had mourned Alexander, had received the telegram about Fergus, had sat with Jock through his nervous collapse, was gone or going. The generation that inherited the family's name and its obligations was operating under pressure the builders had never imagined. Royal level scrutiny, wartime urgency, the genetic anxiety of a bloodline that had produced a pattern of disability it could neither explain nor publicly acknowledge. There is a question that hovers over this moment, a question that no one alive can fully answer. Would Cecilia have stopped it? Would the woman who built the Italian garden at Glamis, who played the piano after dinner, who ran the convalescent hospital during the war, who buried 3 of her children and carried the grief of it into every room she entered, would that woman have allowed her granddaughters to be placed in a Victorian institution and effectively removed from the family record? There is no way to know. Cecilia was dead. And the family code she built, the code of endurance, of privacy, of structure above all, was the very code that made the institutionalization possible. She built the walls. She could not control what the walls were used for after she was gone. Fenella was 51 years old. She had been widowed for 11 years. She had 4 daughters, 2 of whom she was about to place in an institution from which they would not return. Whatever she felt, and the record does not tell us what she felt, does not preserve a single letter, a single diary entry, a single sentence of her private response to this moment. She was about to do the thing that would define her family's legacy, not for years, but for generations. Not a legacy of castles or titles or royal weddings or gardens tended with devotion. A legacy of silence. A legacy of 2 women who carried one of Britain's most famous surnames and spent decades in a place where no one used it. The morning of the admission approached, June 1941. The paperwork was in order. The beds were allocated. The transport was arranged. Royal Earlswood Hospital, with its Victorian corridors and its dormitory wards and its exercise grounds where residents walked in supervised lines, beneath the Surrey sky, was ready to receive 5 new patients from 2 of Britain's most established families. The patients themselves, young women whose conditions meant they could not fully understand what was happening to them, could not consent to it, could not object in terms the world would register, were about to begin a chapter of their lives that the family intended no one outside its walls would ever read. Catherine Bowes-Lyon was 15 years old. She had grown up without a father. She had grown up in a household shaped by grief, silence, and the particular pressures of a family whose name was becoming more famous with every passing year. She was about to be taken from that household and placed in an institution where she would remain for the rest of her life. She would not leave Earlswood or the care home that succeeded it until her death in 2014. She would spend 73 years inside the system that was about to receive her. Narissa was 22. She was an adult, technically, though her condition meant that adulthood in the conventional sense, autonomy, choice, self-determination, was not available to her. She would spend the next 45 years at Earlswood until her death in 1986. No family member would attend her funeral. The door was about to close. And when it closed, it would stay closed for decades, until a journalist, a reference book, and a plastic grave marker forced it open again. In the days before the admission, Fenella's household would have looked to anyone passing by like any other household in wartime Britain adjusting to wartime circumstance. The rhythm, it does not tell us whether Fenella explained or tried to explain or sat with her daughters in a room in the days before and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that could make this comprehensible. What the record does tell us is that the admission was arranged for June 1941. It tells us that 5 women from 2 related families were involved. It tells us the name of the hospital and the names of the patients. Everything else, the human texture of the days before. The last breakfast, the last walk in a garden, the last night in a bed that was not institutional, must be inferred from the circumstances and from the silence that followed. Fenella was 51. She had been a widow for 11 years. She had spent those 11 years raising 4 daughters, 2 of them profoundly disabled, inside a family whose public profile had intensified beyond anything she could have anticipated when she married Jock in 1914. She had watched her husband deteriorate and die. She had watched her sister-in-law become queen consort. She had navigated the particular loneliness of a dependent widow in a household that valued independence above all else. the loneliness of being necessary to no one in the family's power structure, and essential to two children the power structure could not accommodate. And now she was about to hand those children over to an institution and return to a house that would be, in the most literal sense, emptier than it had been the day before. Whether she resisted, whether she wept, whether she maintained the composure the family code demanded, whether she felt relief or guilt or the numb exhaustion of a woman who had run out of alternatives, none of this survives. Fenella's interior life at the moment of the most consequential decision attributed to her is a blank, not because she had no feelings, but because no one thought to record them, or because the family's culture of silence extended even to the private grief of a mother losing daily contact with her children. The other side of the equation, the Fane household, Harriet's family, preparing to send three daughters to the same place on the same day, is equally opaque. The coordination between the families implies communication, planning, a shared understanding of what was being done. But the content of that communication, the words exchanged between two sisters whose children shared the same hereditary condition and the same institutional destination, is gone, lost to the privacy that these families maintained as a matter of instinct and as a matter of policy. What survives is the act itself. June 1941. Royal Earlswood Hospital, Red Hill, Surrey. Red Hill. The hospital sat south of London, in the Surrey commuter belt, close enough to the capital to be practical, but far enough away to be discreet. The journey from wherever Fenella's household was based would have taken an hour or two by car, time enough for the landscape to change from the domestic to the institutional, from the familiar to the foreign, from a world the women knew to a world they would never have encountered before. The approach to the hospital would have been along ordinary suburban roads, past ordinary houses, past the kind of unremarkable English countryside that surrounds every institution of this type, as if the ordinariness of the setting could normalize what was about to happen inside. The buildings would have been familiar to anyone who had seen a Victorian hospital. Red brick, long corridors, high ceilings designed for ventilation rather than beauty, windows set high in the walls, the particular institutional architecture that prioritizes supervision over comfort. The grounds were extensive, like lawns, paths, exercise areas, but they were grounds designed for managed activity, not for freedom. There would have been other residents visible, other patients going about their institutional routines, other lives already absorbed into the system that Narissa and Catherine were about to enter. The particular institutional smell, carbolic, cooked food, disinfectant, the close scent of human habitation without adequate privacy, would have been present from the moment the doors opened. There would have been a reception area, or something serving that function, a desk, a clerk, forms to be signed, medical records to be initiated, the bureau. What mattered was the diagnosis, the bed number, the ward allocation, the daily schedule that would now govern their lives. There is something about the administrative quality of the moment that makes it harder, not easier, to bear. This was not a scene of visible cruelty. There was no locking of chains, no dragging of unwilling patients through corridors. There was paperwork. There were signatures. There was presumably a handover, and the family members who had brought the women stepping back, the institutional staff stepping forward, the transfer of responsibility accomplished through the mundane mechanics of admission procedure. The women themselves, whose understanding of what was happening to them cannot be determined from the record, expus, were processed, that is the word, not welcomed, not treated, processed, entered into a system that would manage their lives for decades, a system that did not know or care that one of them was the niece of the Queen of England, because that fact was precisely the fact that everyone involved had agreed to forget. Catherine was 15 years old. She had never chosen to come here. She could not have chosen to come here, because the condition that brought her here was the same condition that prevented her from exercising choice in the way the world recognizes choice. She was a child placed by adults in an institution for adults, and the adults who placed her there believed, or allowed themselves to believe, that this was the right thing, that this was care. Narissa was 22. She had spent her childhood in a household shadowed by her father's decline and death, in a family that was rising to national prominence, while her own branch was contracting into invisibility. She had been a person in the world, and a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter of an earl, a niece of a queen. Now she was a patient, a number, a bed in a dormitory ward in a Victorian hospital in Surrey. And the world that had produced her, the world of Glamis and St. Paul's Walden, and the Italian garden, and the piano after dinner, closed behind her as completely as if it had never existed. The door closed, and it would stay closed for 45 years. for Narissa. For Catherine, it would stay closed for 73. What followed was not a single tragedy, but a sustained one. The kind that does not make for dramatic cinema, because its mechanism is not violence or betrayal, but repetition. The same ward, week after week, month after month, year after year. The same beds in the same rows, the same routines, rising at the same time, eating at the same time, walking in the same grounds at the same time, returning to the same dormitory at the same time. The same institutional meals, served on institutional plates, at institutional tables. The same absence of choice, what to eat, what to wear, when to sleep, where to go, whom to see. The same absence of the outside world, year after year after year, while the outside world went on without them, while wars ended, while queens were crowned, while families gathered and celebrated and grieved and carried on, while the family that had placed them here continued to live its public life, as though two of its members had simply ceased to exist. The daily reality of institutional life for Narissa and Catherine can be reconstructed only in general terms, because no personal account from either woman survives. Residents of Earlswood in this period lived in large dormitory wards, open rooms with rows of beds, minimal personal space, no privacy to speak of. They were dressed in institutional clothing. They were supervised throughout the day. Those capable of simple tasks were directed toward workshops or domestic duties, laundry, cleaning, basic handwork, not as therapy in any therapeutic sense, but as occupation, a way of filling the hours that institutional life generated in such abundance. There were walks in the grounds, supervised. There were communal recreation rooms, supervised. There were presumably moments of quiet, or sitting in a chair by a window, looking out at the Surrey sky, existing in the particular blankness that institutional time creates when every hour is like every other hour, and the calendar has no shape beyond the repetition of meals. Whether Narissa and Catherine understood where they were, whether they remembered the household they had left, whether they missed their mother, their sisters, the particular sounds and smells of a family home, whether they experienced their confinement as suffering, or whether their conditions were such that the institutional routine provided a kind of stability that felt, from the inside, like enough. These questions cannot be answered, and the impossibility of answering them is itself part of the tragedy, because the people best placed to speak to the inner lives of these women were the women themselves, and they were the people the world heard from least. The 1940s became the 1950s. Britain changed around them. The war ended. The welfare state was built. The National Health Service was created in 1948, and the great institutions for the disabled were absorbed into the public health system, their populations becoming NHS patients rather than private charges, their funding shifting from charitable endowment and family payment to state provision. Earlswood continued to operate, its routines largely unchanged by the administrative reorganization happening above it. The residents grew older. The staff turned over. The buildings age, the Victorian fabric deteriorating in the way that all institutional buildings deteriorate when the funding is inadequate and the political attention is elsewhere. And Narissa and Catherine remained, two women whose surname was Bowes-Lyon, whose aunt was one of the most famous women in the world, and whose existence was known to almost no one outside the hospital's walls. In 1952, George VI died, and Elizabeth, Cecilia's youngest daughter, the girl who had grown up at St. Paul's Walden and married a prince, became the Queen Mother. She moved to Clarence House. She became, over the following decades, one of the most beloved public figures in Britain. The smiling grandmother of the nation, the woman who waved from balconies in open hospitals and attended race meetings and visited the Chelsea Flower Show with an air of warmth and good humor that the country adored. She lived to be 101. She was photographed thousands of times. She was written about in every newspaper in the country. Her public image, composed, warm, impeccably dressed, endlessly dutiful, was one of the most carefully maintained in British public life. And somewhere in Surrey, two of her nieces were living in a dormitory ward, wearing institutional clothing, eating institutional food, with no public acknowledgement of their existence and no apparent plan for their return to the family that had placed them there. Later reporting would suggest that the Queen Mother may not have known the full truth about Narissa and Catherine until 1982, more than 40 years after their admission. The account, pieced together from various sources, indicates that in or around that year, someone connected to the hospital, a supporter or administrator, wrote to the Queen Mother to inform her that her nieces were alive and living at Earlswood. The response, according to these accounts, was that the Queen Mother subsequently arranged for money to be sent to the hospital, money that was used to buy the women small comforts, toys, sweets, the kind of modest gifts that could be provided within the institutional setting. Whether she visited them personally or sent anyone to visit on her behalf is not established. What is established is that if these accounts are accurate, the Queen Mother learned that her nieces were alive or had been alive throughout the decades when they were listed as dead in Burke's peerage, and that her response was a financial contribution rather than a public correction. The entry in Burke's was not amended, the family's silence was not broken, the institutional arrangement was not challenged, the money bought sweets, it did not buy acknowledgement. Whether the Queen Mother's apparent ignorance until 1982 was genuine, whether she truly did not know for 41 years that her brother's daughters were alive and confined in an institution, or whether it was the kind of structured not knowing that aristocratic families are capable of maintaining, where the information exists in the household but no one speaks of it and no one asks, is one of the questions the story cannot definitively resolve. Both possibilities are disturbing. If she did not know, it means the family's code of silence was so effective that it could conceal the existence of two living relatives from a woman who was in regular contact with other family members for decades. If she did know, it means she chose not to act on and chose or felt unable to leave her nieces in institutional care while she lived in Clarence House, and the country celebrated her as the embodiment of family warmth. The silence that surrounded Narissa and Catherine was not passive. It was actively maintained, and the most devastating evidence of that maintenance appeared not in a hospital record, but in a reference book. In 1963, the editors of Burke's Peerage, the authoritative reference work on the British aristocracy, the book that tracked every birth, marriage, and death in every titled family in the country, published an edition that listed both Narissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon as dead. Narissa was recorded as having died in 1940. Catherine was recorded as having died in 1961. Both women were alive. Narissa was 44 years old and living in Earlswood. Catherine was 37 years old and living in Earlswood. And a book that prided itself on the accuracy of its genealogical record, a book that families provided information to directly, had published death dates for two living women. How this happened is one of the story's most troubling questions, and it is a question that has never been fully answered, because the people who could answer it have not done so. Burke's Peerage compiled its information from families. The process was simple. The editors wrote to families, or families wrote to the editors, and the details, births, marriages, deaths, titles, successions, were published as provided. The system relied on trust. It relied on the assumption that families would report their own genealogical facts accurately, because the purpose of the book was to be the authoritative record, and an authoritative record is only as reliable as its sources. If Narissa and Catherine were listed as dead, it was because someone connected to the family, someone authorized to provide genealogical information on the family's behalf, had told Burkes they were dead, had provided specific dates of death, had, in effect, written two living women out of the family's official history and replaced their ongoing lives with fictional death dates. Whether that someone was a family member acting with full knowledge of what they were doing, whether it was a solicitor transmitting information they had been given without questioning it, whether it was an administrative error, a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a failure of attention, compounded by years of indifference and never corrected. None of these explanations is fully satisfactory, and each carries its own implication. If it was deliberate, it was a calculated act of erasure. If it was accidental, it was an accident that no one in the family bothered to correct for decades, which suggests that the accuracy of the record, where Narissa and Catherine were concerned, was a matter of indifference. The family that cared deeply about its place in Burke's, the family that tracked its own lineage with the precision that centuries of aristocratic habit demanded, either chose to falsify that lineage or chose not to correct a falsification. The effect was the same. Two living women, both carrying the Bowes-Lyon surname, were publicly recorded as deceased while they were alive and confined in an institution chosen for them by the family whose record now denied their existence. The false death dates were not corrected. Not in the next edition, not in the edition after that, not in any edition before the press exposure of 1987. For more than 2 decades, anyone consulting Burke's Peerage to trace the Bowes-Lyon family tree would have found Narissa and Catherine listed as dead. Their lives closed, their stories ended, their existence reduced to a pair of fabricated dates in a book that their family had every reason to keep accurate and every incentive in this particular case to keep false. The institution held them physically. The reference book held them symbolically. Between the two, the hospital ward and the printed page, the women were doubly confined, invisible in person and invisible in the record. It was the most complete disappearance a family could achieve without the women actually being dead. The years continued, and the family's other members moved through their lives in the way that families do, aging, changing, losing members, gaining new ones, the generational wheel turning. Fenella died in 1966 at 77. She had survived Jock by 36 years. She had spent 25 of those years as the mother of two institutionalized daughters whose existence was not publicly acknowledged. What her final years were like, whether she visited Earlswood, whether she maintained contact, whether the weight of the decision pressed on her in the long nights, in the quiet hours, in the moments when the mind turns to the things it has tried to set aside. The record does not say. She died carrying whatever she carried, and she was buried. And with her burial, the last direct parental connection between the sisters and the family that had produced them was severed. From 1966 onward, Narissa and Catherine were not merely institutionalized. They were orphaned, their father dead since 1930, their mother dead since 1966, their existence denied in the authoritative record of their own family's history, their connection to the living world reduced to whatever relationships the institutional staff provided and whatever residual awareness the wider family maintained behind its wall of silence. Anne, their elder sister, was alive throughout the 60s and 70s, living the visible life her sisters could not. She had married Viscount Anson, had divorced, had married Prince Georg of Denmark in 1950, a second marriage that placed her within the orbit of European royalty and gave her a title, Princess Anne of Denmark, that her hidden sister would never hear used. Whether Anne visited her sisters during these decades, whether she maintained any form of contact with Earlswood, whether she sent letters or gifts or money is another of the contested questions that the family's privacy has made impossible to resolve definitively. Family-linked accounts suggest some form of ongoing connection, that the abandonment was not as total as later reporting would suggest. Institutional accounts suggest otherwise. Anne herself died in September 1980 at 63, without having publicly acknowledged her sister's existence or their institutional confinement. Her daughter, Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, would later become the family's most prominent defender on this subject, arguing that the later documentary depictions simplified a more complex reality. Diana, the third daughter, had married Peter Somerville in 1960 and lived quietly, out of the public eye. The sister whose fate attracted neither the visibility of Anne's life nor the invisibility of Narissa and Catherine's. She was the daughter who neither rose nor fell. She remained inside the circle of the acknowledged family, carrying the name without the weight that the name imposed on those who could not carry it. The decades passed. The 1960s became the 70s. The 70s became the 80s. The world that had built institutions like Earlswood was slowly, belatedly, beginning to question whether institutions like Earlswood should exist. The deinstitutionalization movement, driven by changing attitudes toward disability, by the advocacy of families and campaigners, by academic research showing that community-based care produced better outcomes than segregation, and by a growing recognition that the Victorian model of the large residential hospital was neither humane nor effective, was gathering force across Britain. Community care was replacing institutional confinement. Residents were being moved gradually into smaller facilities, group homes, supported living arrangements that offered something closer to ordinary life. The great Victorian hospitals were emptying out, their populations declining, their buildings falling into disrepair, their long corridors echoing with the absences of the people who had once filled them. But Narissa and Catherine remained. They were elderly women now, Narissa in her 60s, Catherine in her 50s, living inside a system that was winding down around them. The institutional world that had received them as young women in 1941 was dissolving, its certainties challenged, its methods discredited, its buildings scheduled for closure. But the women themselves were still there, still inside the routine that had governed their lives for decades, their family connection unknown to the staff who cared for them in the later years, their names carrying no more weight inside the care system than any other patients. They had outlived the era that had confined them. They had not escaped it. On the 6th of January 1986, Narissa Bowes-Lyon died. She was 66 years old. She had spent 45 years in institutional care. 45 years in which the world outside had changed beyond recognition, in which the British Empire had dissolved, in which a new queen had been crowned, in which men had walked on the moon, in which the Bowes-Lyon name had become synonymous with royal warmth and national affection. She had been admitted as a young woman of 22, and she had died as an elderly woman of 66, and the entire span of her adult life, everything between admission and death, had been spent inside the system that was supposed to care for her. She had never married. She had never lived independently. She had never made a choice about where to go or what to do or whom to see that was not mediated by the institutional structure that governed her existence. She had been, for 45 years, a patient, a resident, a number in a system. Her funeral was attended by hospital staff. No family members were present. No one from the Bowes-Lyon household came to Surrey to mark the passing of a woman who shared their blood and their name. No one from the royal family. No one from the wider aristocratic world that the Bowes-Lyons inhabited. The staff who had cared for Narissa, who had fed her, dressed her, walked with her in the grounds, supervised her daily routine for years, were the people who stood at her graveside. They were the people who said goodbye. They were, in the end, the closest thing to family that the institutional system had provided. She was buried at Redstone Cemetery near the hospital in a plot that was marked with a plastic tag and a serial number. There was no headstone. There was no engraved inscription. There was no indication, nothing visible, nothing permanent, nothing that a visitor to the cemetery could read. That the woman buried in that plot was the niece of the Queen Mother, the granddaughter of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, the great niece of a king. A plastic tag, a serial number, the same kind of marker used for any unclaimed or unvisited grave in any municipal cemetery in the country. The woman who had been born into one of Britain's most established families, a family whose ancestral castle had stood since the 14th century, whose name appeared in every edition of Debrett's and Burke's, whose connection to the crown was the family's defining public characteristic, was buried with less ceremony and less permanence than most people would accord a stranger. That image, the plastic tag, the serial number, the anonymous plot in a Surrey cemetery, is the story's most condensed and devastating symbol. It says everything about what happened to Narissa and Catherine without needing a single additional word of explanation. Title without protection. Name without care. A family that could maintain a castle for 600 years, but could not maintain a gravestone for a woman who carried its name. Catherine was still alive. She was 59 years old, still inside the care system, still unknown to the public, still listed as dead in Burke's peerage. She would live for another 28 years and would outlive the Queen Mother, would outlive the century, would die in 2014 at the age of 87, having spent 73 years in institutional and residential care. But Catherine's story, and the question of what happened to her after the scandal broke, belongs to the next chapter, because the silence was about to end. In 1987, a year after Narissa's death, a journalist began asking questions. The questions were simple. Were there members of the Bowes-Lyon family who had been placed in the institutions and never acknowledged? Were there women related to the Queen Mother who had spent decades in hospital care without public knowledge? Were there entries in Burke's peerage that recorded living people as dead? The answers to all three questions were yes. And when those answers became public, the family that had spent a century learning how to manage its private affairs in private was about to discover what happened when the privacy failed. When the walls that Cecilia built, the walls that held chaos out and damage in, finally came down, and the story they had contained spilled into the light for the entire country to see. The story broke in 1987, and it broke in the way that stories about the British establishment break. Not through a single explosive revelation, but through the accumulation of details that could no longer be explained away once someone thought to look. The catalyst was a journalist investigating the entries in Burke's peerage. The kind of investigative work that depended not on classified sources or whistleblowers, but on the simple act of cross-referencing. The investigation was straightforward, once someone thought to conduct it. Compare the death dates recorded for Narissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon with the actual records held by the institutions where they had lived. The comparison revealed what the family had managed to conceal for more than 2 decades. Narissa had been listed as having died in 1940, a year before she was even admitted to Earlswood. She had in fact died in January 1986, 46 years later than the date the family had provided to the peerage. Catherine had been listed as having died in 1961. She was alive. She was 61 years old. She was living in a care facility in Surrey. She was the niece of the Queen Mother. and the reference book that the entire British aristocracy relied upon to record its own history had been carrying false information about her for a quarter of a century. The press coverage was immediate, extensive, and unsparing. The tabloids ran the story with the energy they reserved for scandals that combined royalty, secrecy, and the mistreatment of the vulnerable. A combination that was, in 1987, as commercially potent as it was morally uncomfortable. The Sun and the Daily Mirror put the story on their front pages. The broadsheets, the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, covered it with more restraint but no less thoroughness. Their reporting focused not on sensationalism but on the documented facts, which were sensational enough without embellishment. The essential narrative was reported in full. Two women, both first-degree relatives of the Queen Mother, had been placed in a mental institution in 1941, had been listed as dead in Burke's peerage while they were alive, had spent decades in institutional care, with little or no publicly documented family contact, and had been effectively erased from the official genealogical record of one of Britain's most prominent families. Narissa had died the previous year, her funeral attended only by hospital staff, her grave marked by a plastic tag. Catherine was still alive. The family had not corrected the record voluntarily. The correction had come only because someone outside the family had thought to check. The public reaction was a mixture of outrage and bewilderment that cut across class lines in a way that few royal stories did. This was not a scandal of infidelity or financial impropriety, the usual fare of royal embarrassment. This was something more disturbing. The systematic concealment of two vulnerable human beings by a family that the nation had been taught to admire for its warmth, its duty, and its commitment to service. How could a family this prominent, a family connected to the crown, a family whose every christening and wedding was reported in the court circular, have hidden two of its members for nearly half a century? How could two women carrying the Bowes-Lyon name have lived and died in institutional care while their aunt attended race meetings, opened hospitals, and waved from balconies? The questions were simple. The answers were not, and the family, characteristically, offered very few of them. The response from the royal household was muted in a way that satisfied almost no one. A Buckingham Palace spokesperson acknowledged the situation in terms that were careful, brief, and designed to close the subject rather than open it. There were indications, reported through various channels, that the Queen Mother had been aware of her niece's existence since around 1982, when hospital supporters had written to her, and that she had subsequently arranged for money to be sent. Money used to buy small comforts, toys, and sweets, the kind of modest provisions that could be made within the institutional setting. That detail, the toys and sweets, became one of the most discussed aspects of the story because it encapsulated the family's response in miniature, an acknowledgement that was also a deflection, a gesture of care that simultaneously confirmed the distance between the carer and the cared for. The Queen Mother had not visited her nieces. She had not brought them home. She had not publicly acknowledged their existence. She had sent money for sweets. The gap between what the gesture offered and what the situation demanded was, for many observers, the most damning detail of all. The Burke's peerage entry was corrected. A headstone was eventually provided for Narissa's grave at Redstone Cemetery, replacing the plastic tag and serial number that had marked the plot since her burial. The correction came after public exposure, not before. The headstone came after scandal, not after death. The family's acknowledgement of its hidden members was, in every visible respect, reactive rather than voluntary, a response to being caught, not a decision to confess. And that reactiveness was itself a continuation of the pattern the story had already established. The family knew how to respond to external pressure. It did not know how to generate internal change. There is something about the timing of that correction that deserves to be held alongside everything else in this story. For years, for decades, and the family had the power to correct the Burke's entry, to provide a proper burial marker, to visit the institution, to bring the women home, to tell the truth. It chose not to, or more precisely, it chose the continuation of silence over the disruption of acknowledgement, because silence was the family's natural state, and acknowledgement would have required an act of will that the family code did not support. The correction came only when the alternative, continued public exposure, continued press scrutiny, continued questions that had no acceptable answer, became more damaging than the admission itself. Even in the moment of exposure, the family's instinct was the same instinct it had always had. Manage the situation, contain the damage, control the narrative. The difference was that by 1987, The narrative was no longer controllable because the narrative now belonged to the press and to the public, and the public was not willing to accept managed silence as an adequate response to the disappearance of two human beings. Catherine was still alive. She had survived the scandal, though what the press attention meant to a woman with severe intellectual disabilities, whether she was aware of it, whether it changed anything in her daily experience, is unknowable. She had survived the transformation of her private confinement into a national story, and she would go on surviving, would go on living inside the care system for another 27 years. When Earlswood closed in 1997, part of the broader program of deinstitutionalization that was dismantling the Victorian hospital system across Britain, Catherine was transferred to a smaller residential care facility. The precise details of her later years are sparse, guarded by the privacy that the care system accords its residents and by the silence that the family maintained even after the public exposure. She lived in supported care. She was looked after by professional staff. She was, by the standards of the modern care system, provided for. But she was not reclaimed. The family knew she was there. The world knew she was there. But being known about and being cared for in the fullest sense, being visited, being held, being treated as a member of a family rather than a resident of a facility are not the same thing. And the gap between the two is the space in which Catherine spent the last decades of her life. After the initial explosion of press interest, the story receded from the front pages and entered a different kind of existence. The kind reserved for scandals that are too disturbing to forget, but too complicated to sustain as daily news. The essential facts were lodged in the public consciousness. The Bowes-Lyon hidden cousins became one of those pieces of knowledge that people carried around without quite knowing what to do with it. A story that surfaced occasionally in conversation, in retrospectives, in articles about the royal family's less comfortable history, but that never quite produced the reckoning it seemed to demand. The family, meanwhile, carried on. That is what the Bowes-Lyons had always done. The lesson Cecilia taught by example, the code Claude reinforced by temperament, the pattern that had held through childhood death, war, institutionalization, and now public scandal. The family carried on. The Queen Mother lived for another 15 years after the scandal broke. She continued to attend public engagements. She continued to open buildings, visit regiments, appear at the races, host luncheons at Clarence House. She was photographed thousands more times. She was cheered thousands more times. The warmth that the public felt for her did not dissipate, because the public's relationship with the Queen Mother was built on decades of accumulated affection, and because the story of the hidden cousins, however disturbing, was not sufficient to dismantle an image that had been constructed over 60 years. She carried whatever she carried about Narissa and Catherine, guilt or sorrow, or the particular kind of carefully maintained not knowing that allows a person to continue functioning inside an impossible contradiction. And she carried it privately, as the family code demanded, and she did not speak of it publicly, and no interviewer was ever permitted to ask her about it directly. She died in March 2002 at the age of 101 at Royal Lodge, Windsor, with her surviving daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, at her bedside. Her funeral was a national event, the coffin carried through London on a gun carriage, the streets lined with mourners, the service at Westminster Abbey attended by members of royal families from across Europe. She was mourned as one of the most beloved figures in modern British history, the woman who had stayed during the Blitz, who had raised a queen, who had embodied grace and duty and warmth for nearly a century of public life. She had been, for many people, the last living connection to a world of royal dignity that felt increasingly remote in the modern era. The story of Narissa and Catherine was mentioned in some of the obituaries that followed and in the retrospective assessments that newspapers and broadcasters published in the weeks after her death. It was not mentioned in all of them. For most of the people who mourned her, it was not the defining story of her life. It was a shadow, troubling, persistent, unresolved, on the edge of a portrait they preferred to see whole. Cecilia's other surviving children had, by the time of the 1987 scandal, all died. Michael had died in 1953 at 60. David had died in 1961 at 59. Rose had died in 1967. Patrick, the 15th Earl of Strathmore, had died in 1949, only 5 years after inheriting the title from Claude. A brief tenure that meant the generation that presided over the family's most consequential act held the earldom only fleetingly. The 16th and 17th Earls continued the line, maintaining Glamis, holding the title, carrying forward the family name into an era that neither Cecilia nor Claude could have imagined. an era of tabloid journalism, television documentaries, and streaming services that would dramatize the family's darkest chapter for a global audience. Anne's daughter, Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, emerged as the family's most vocal defender in the years after the scandal. She gave interviews in which she challenged the narrative of total abandonment, arguing that the family had maintained contact with Narissa and Catherine, that relatives had sent gifts over the years, and that the later documentaries had simplified a complex situation into a morality tale that served the media's purposes rather than the truth. Her defense was passionate and in its own terms sincere. The defense of a woman speaking for a grandmother she loved and a family she believed had been unfairly condemned. She argued that the institutionalization had been recommended by doctors, that it reflected the medical consensus of the time, that the family had done what it was advised to do, and that judging the decisions of the 1940s by the standards of the 21st century was both unfair and unhistorical. Her arguments had force, but they also had limits, because even the most sympathetic writing of the family's behavior could not fully account for the Burke's peerage entries, the false death dates, the plastic grave marker, the decades of public silence. Even if the institutionalization itself was defensible as a product of its era, the concealment was harder to defend. And it was the concealment, not the institutionalization, that the public found unforgivable. After the initial explosion of press interest, the story receded from the front pages and entered a different kind of existence. The kind reserved for scandals that are too disturbing to forget but too complicated to sustain as daily news. The essential facts were lodged in the public consciousness. The Bowes-Lyon hidden cousins became one of those pieces of knowledge that people carried around without quite knowing what to do with it, surfacing occasionally in conversation, in retrospectives about the royal family, in articles about the history of disability in Britain, but never quite producing the institutional reckoning it seemed to demand. No public inquiry was held. No formal investigation was conducted into the Burke's entries or the circumstances of the admission. No member of the family was called upon in any official capacity to explain what had happened or why. The story did, however, contribute to a broader shift in public attitudes toward disability and institutionalization that was already underway in Britain by the late 1980s. The exposure of the hidden cousins added a human, visceral, and inescapable dimension to what had been, for many people, an abstract policy debate about the closure of long-stay hospitals and the transition toward community care. Here was proof, specific, named, connected to the most visible family in the country, that the institutional system had not merely failed in general terms, but had consumed individual lives, real lives, named lives, with devastating and irreversible completeness. The story became a reference point in advocacy for disability rights in Britain and beyond, cited by campaigners, journalists, and academics as evidence that even the most privileged families, families whose names appeared in the court circular, families connected to the crown itself, had participated willingly in a system that treated disabled people as problems to be managed rather than persons to be respected and included. It gave the deinstitutionalization movement a narrative it could use, a narrative that was all the more powerful because it involved the royal family, because it involved concealment, and because it involved a specific, unbearable image of a grave marked with a plastic tag. For Catherine herself, the years after 1987 were outwardly uneventful in the way that years inside the care system tend to be: structured, supervised, defined by routine rather than by incident. When Earlswood closed in 1997, she was transferred to a smaller residential facility, the kind of purpose-built group home that the community care movement had created to replace the old Victorian hospitals. The change from a large institution to a smaller, more domestic setting would have altered the texture of her daily life. Fewer people, quieter corridors, more individual attention from staff. But it did not alter the fundamental fact of her confinement. She was still living inside a system. She was still being cared for by professionals rather than by family. She was still Catherine Bowes-Lyon, the woman whose name connected her to one of Britain's most famous families and whose life was spent entirely outside the world that family inhabited. Whether any member of the Bowes-Lyon family visited Catherine after the scandal broke, whether the increased public attention translated into increased private attention, whether the family, shamed into acknowledgement, also moved towards something resembling genuine relationship with the surviving cousin they had hidden for so long. These questions remain, like so many questions in this story, unanswered in the public record. What the public record does show is that Catherine lived. She lived through the 90s, through the millennium, through the death of the Queen Mother in 2002, the aunt who had sent money for sweets but had not, so far as anyone knows, ever visited in person. She lived through the Channel 4 documentary in 2011, which brought her story back to public attention when she was 85 years old. She lived until 2014, the last survivor of the 5 women admitted to Earlswood on that day in June 1941. She was the last living proof of what the family had done. In 2011, Channel 4 aired a documentary that brought the story back to national attention with renewed force. The Queen's Hidden Cousins, directed by Kelly Close and produced by Minnow Films, told the story of Narissa and Catherine's institutionalization and the family's concealment of their existence across 4 decades. The program drew on interviews with former Earlswood staff, nurses and carers who described looking after women they had not known were connected to the royal family, who recalled the absence of family visitors, who painted a picture of institutional life that was not abusive in the dramatic sense but was profoundly isolating in the human sense. The documentary presented the story not merely as the failure of a single family, but as the failure of a society that had allowed the institutionalization of disabled people on an industrial scale, and that had permitted families, even prominent ones, to erase inconvenient members from the public record without consequence. It was widely watched and widely discussed. Lady Elizabeth Shakerley publicly rejected its depiction, calling it a distorted account of events she believed were far more complicated than the program had allowed. The cultural afterlife of the story intensified further in November 2020, when Netflix's The Crown devoted an entire episode to Narissa and Catherine in its 4th season. Episode 7, titled The Hereditary Principle, dramatized the story with the liberties that prestige television permits and that historical accuracy does not always survive. The episode fictionalized the manner in which the Queen Mother discovered her niece's institutionalization, inventing a scene in which Princess Margaret uncovers the truth and confronts the Queen Mother directly, a confrontation for which no historical evidence exists. It compressed timelines. It attributed motives and emotion to historical figures based on dramatic logic rather than documentary evidence. It portrayed the Queen Mother weeping with guilt, a scene that may or may not bear any resemblance to what actually happened, and that fact-checkers at Radio Times and elsewhere were quick to flag as invented. But the episode achieved something that journalism and documentary alone had struggled to accomplish. It placed the story of the hidden cousins before a global audience of millions, many of whom were encountering it for the first time. And it did so inside a narrative framework and the dramatized life of the royal family that made the concealment feel not like an obscure historical curiosity, but like an ongoing moral reckoning with consequences that extended into the present. The gap between what the Crown depicted and what the historical record supports is itself instructive. The series offered clarity where the real story offered only ambiguity. It assigned blame where the real story distributed responsibility across a system, an era, and a family whose members each contributed to the outcome without any single individual bearing the full weight of it. The dramatization made the story more powerful and less true, which is the nature of dramatization, and which is also a reminder that the real story, in all its contested, ambiguous, unresolved complexity, is harder to sit with than any fictional version, precisely because it offers no catharsis and no villain and no moment of confrontation that resolves the tension. Catherine Bowes-Lyon died on the 23rd of February 2014 at a residential care home in Surrey. She was 87 years old. She had spent 73 years in institutional and residential care. Admitted at 15, dead at 87, the entirety of her adult life and most of her childhood governed by the decisions of others. She had outlived Narissa by 28 years. She had outlived Fenella by 48 years. She had outlived Anne by 34 years. She had outlived the Queen Mother by 12 years. She had outlived the institution that first received her. Earlswood had closed in 1997 and been transferred to the smaller facility where she spent her final years. She had outlived the era that had confined her, the attitudes that had justified her confinement, and most of the people who had been involved in the decision to confine her. She had not, so far as the public record indicates, ever returned to the world her family inhabited. She had not visited Glamis Castle. She had not walked in the gardens at St. Paul's Waldenbury. She had not sat in the room where Cecilia played the piano, or stood in the chapel where the family gathered on Sundays, or seen the Italian garden her grandmother had designed with such devotion. She had lived inside the care system for 73 years, and she had died inside it, the longest confined member of one of the most publicly visible families in Britain. Today, Glamis Castle still stands in the Angus countryside, its towers rising above the flat farmland as they have for 6 centuries. It is open to the public, as it has been for decades, a tourist destination, a heritage property, a monument to the continuity that the Bowes-Lyon family valued above almost everything else. Visitors walk through the rooms where Cecilia managed her household, where Claude sat in his study, where the children played before war and grief and silence reshaped the house from the inside. The Italian garden is still there, maintained by professional gardeners, its hedges clipped, its pathways swept, a formal space that visitors admire without necessarily knowing the story of the woman who created it or the story of the family that tended it. The castle's exhibition tells the history of the Strathmore line through carefully curated displays, traces the royal connection through Elizabeth's marriage and her daughter's coronation, and presents the dynasty as a narrative of endurance, service, and continuity across the centuries. It is a beautiful place. It is a carefully curated place. And the story it tells is inevitably selective, shaped by the same instinct for presentation that defined the family in life. St. Paul's Walden Bury remains in Bowes-Lyon hands. The house and gardens are still publicly visitable, still maintained with the attention that the family has always brought to its properties. The garden where Elizabeth played as a child, the lawns where the family was photographed in their Edwardian best, the woodland paths and the green theater that gave the estate its character, all of this endures. The physical world the family built has survived intact. The houses stand, the gardens bloom. The name endures in Debrett's and in the national memory. What did not survive, what the stone and the hedges and the carefully maintained records could not preserve, was the completeness of the family itself. 2 of its members were removed, and the removal lasted a lifetime, and the lifetime lasted longer than anyone involved in the original decision could have foreseen. The Bowes-Lyon earldom continues. The current Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, the 19th to hold the title, maintains the family's position in Scotland, holds the seat at Glamis, carries forward a name that now resonates in public memory, not only as the maternal line of the late Queen Elizabeth II, but as the family at the center of one of the most disturbing stories in modern British aristocratic history. The machinery of succession that Claude and Cecilia understood so well still operates. The title passing, the estates maintained, the name carried forward into a century that values transparency in the ways the Victorian and Edwardian aristocracy would have found bewildering and perhaps intolerable. The Fane cousins, Idonia, Etheldreda, and Rosemary, lived out their own institutional lives alongside and in parallel with Narissa and Catherine. Their fates were a mirror of the Bowes-Lyon sisters. The same hereditary condition, the same institutional response, the same erasure from the family record, the same decades of confinement in a system that presented itself as a care and delivered something far less than that word implies. Their story is less well known because the Fane name does not carry the royal connection that made the Bowes-Lyon case nationally explosive, but it is part of the same pattern. 5 women from 2 families, linked by blood and by a shared genetic inheritance, placed in the same institution on the same day, and left there while the families that produced them continued to move through the world as though nothing had been lost. Narissa's grave at Redstone Cemetery now has a headstone. It was provided after the 1987 exposure, a correction made under the pressure of public scrutiny, a belated acknowledgement that the woman buried there deserved more than a plastic tag and a serial number. The headstone bears her name. It bears her dates, the real ones, not the ones that had been published in Burke's Peerage for decades. It does not bear an epitaph that explains what happened to her or why. The stone is simply there, a marker where for years there was none, a name where for years there was a number, a small late act of recognition that arrived decades after it might have mattered to the woman it was meant to honor, and that matters now only as evidence of a family that could not bring itself to acknowledge what it had done until the world forced it to. This was a family that knew how to preserve houses, titles, gardens, military honor, dynastic marriages and public composure, a family that maintained a castle for 600 years, a garden for a century, and a public image through 2 world wars, an abdication crisis, and the transformation of a daughter into a queen. What it couldn't preserve, Bascom, what it would not allow itself to preserve because preservation would have required the one thing the family code forbade, was an honest, visible, sustained relationship with the members of its own household who could not perform the role the name demanded. Narissa and Catherine were not hidden because they were unloved, or not only because they were unloved. They were hidden because the family's deepest skill, the skill Cecilia built and Claude reinforced, and every subsequent generation inherited, was the conversion of private difficulty into managed silence. And that skill had no mechanism for distinguishing between a social embarrassment that could be absorbed and a human life that deserved more than absorption. The code that held the house together was the same code that allowed 2 of its members to be placed in an institution and recorded as dead. There is no single villain in this story. There is no neat moral. There is only the fact of a family that built something magnificent and enduring, and that spent decades unable or unwilling to extend to its most vulnerable members the same care it lavished on its gardens, its castle, and its name. If you found this story worth your time, please consider liking and subscribing so you never miss another video.